I want to welcome everybody who is giving us your afternoon or the next hour and a half or an hour of your time today. We really appreciate it. And before I introduce our really wonderful speakers who we have the honor of having here today, I want to just kind of go over some basic Zoom things that I think we're all getting more and more familiar with, which is that this is a webinar, so we won't be able to see you, but we can communicate with you either through the chat room or through Q&A, and Amanda Garces is our Director of Policy Education Outreach, and she will be watching the chat room, and I will be monitoring the Q&A. And for those of you who just joined us, my name is Bohr, and I am the Executive Director and Legal Counsel of the Vermont Human Rights Commission here in Montpelier, although we have jurisdiction over the entire state of Vermont. And I wanted to just share with you that the hope for this forum was really to create a space to have a discussion around empowerment and empowering each other and ourselves and our families and our communities to work towards this shared goal of liberation and freedom and equity. And we know with COVID-19 that we have seen an increase in hate crimes and hate incidents and bias-motivated incidents against Asian Americans. And it was sort of important to create this space to have discussions about how to talk and how to have difficult conversations around xenophobia and racism. And I just wanted to also share that for those of you who don't know, the Human Rights Commission is an enforcement entity in the state of Vermont, and we investigate claims of discrimination in state government employment, in housing, and in places of public accommodations, which actually means everything. So it always sounds funny, but it's businesses, but it also includes hospitals and schools and roads and prisons. And so if anyone has experienced discrimination, please go to our website, call us, email us, contact us, and we can do an intake and see if it's the kind of case that would trigger our governing statutes, and we would open it for an investigation. And now I am going to briefly introduce our wonderful speakers and then also have them introduce themselves as well. I'm going to start with Joyce Lee. Joyce is a licensed clinical social worker and a social work researcher who uses developmental and family theories to investigate family processes, and she emphasizes father involvement that support low-income, ethnic, and race minority children's well-being. Joyce is currently earning her PhD in social work and developmental psychology at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And prior to graduate school, she worked as a licensed social worker and coordinated a mentoring program at a community-based youth empowerment program in New Brunswick, New Jersey. She also worked at the Institute for the Study of Child Development at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. She completed her master's degree in social work from Columbia University in New York with a focus on international child welfare, and received her bachelor's degree in social work at Rutgers University in New Brunswick in New Jersey. Joyce is also the author of a children's book titled Young, Proud, Songji. It's a children's book on fighting anti-Asian racism during COVID-19. Thank you so much, Joyce, for being with us today.
Thank you.
And I am gonna introduce Anna and then have you both kind of share something about yourself. Anna is a Vermonter and teaches at Vermont College of Fine Arts in the Writing for Children and Young Adults MFA program. Anna has been an English and history teacher for middle schoolers, a pastry chef, I love it, a video store clerk, a ticket taker for Cirque du Soleil, and a substitute for kindergartners. Anna, that makes me want to describe myself as someone who's also been an onion peeler, because I spent many years doing that. on my parents' farm. So I go, yeah, I think I should come back. She has her Master's of Fine Arts in Writing for Children and Young Adults from Vermont College of Fine Arts. Her first novel, A Step from Heaven, has garnered awards such as the Michael L. Prince Award, International Reading Association Award, National Book Award finalist, ALA Best Books for Young Adults, and New York Times Book Review notable. It is a book about the acculturation of a Korean American girl in America. Anna is also the author of Wait for Me, The Fold, and The Place Between Breaths. So we are so honored to have you both. And we would just really love to hear a little bit about yourself. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Bor and Amanda and the Human Rights Commission for this invitation. It's just so good to be here with everyone. Well, that's a good question. What do I share? Well, speaking of being a pastry chef, I've been trying to bake as much as possible whenever I have the time during COVID, and I feel like that's something that a lot of us are trying to tackle. I'm trying to like perfect this blueberry muffin recipe, but maybe I need to ping you to get some like tips. But yeah, those are some of the things that I've been trying to do. Go on walks with my 1-year-old son and husband during the pandemic when the weather's nice in Michigan, which doesn't last for a long time. So I'm trying to enjoy that as much as possible. But yeah, baking and walking. Mm-hmm.
So, Bor, when you said that I'm a Vermonter, I was like, ah, because in my heart, I have always been a Californian. Even more than like, even more than I think in some ways being Korean, I really identify as a Californian because that's where I grew up. That's where I lived for a lot of my adult life, and then moved to Vermont about 15 years ago. So I've been here long enough to feel like, I know Vermont, but I don't feel like a Vermonter at all. So Joyce, part of the reason why I became so fascinated with pastries and things was when I was growing up, my mom didn't make any American food really. And so the only way that I could get it was to start making it myself. So I started with little box mixes because I wanted cupcakes and, cakes and things like that. And that's how I kind of found my affinity and love for cooking and for baking and things like that. So it's something that I still do today. I've been doing not as much baking, but definitely just trying to make as many different kinds of foods and just experiencing a lot of different cuisine from all over the world, which is something we don't always get to eat here in Vermont. Although now we have a Nepalese Indian restaurant in town, so I'm excited for that.
That is really exciting. I love it. I know we are becoming more and more diverse in terms of the restaurants that we have available. So that's exciting. Joyce, I'd like to ask you a question about your book. Why did you write this book, and sort of what were your hopes in doing it?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I feel like the motivation for this book really came from both personal and professional for me. Personal meaning, I have a 13-month-old, and I was thinking like, oh my gosh, COVID-19 happened and all these things are happening to the Asian American community. How do I be proactive about having conversations down the road with my son? And I was just trying to look for children's books primarily to see if there were any resources out there. I struggled a little bit. I spotted a few, but I felt like there wasn't content speaking directly to what was happening right now. In particular, anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. So that was one motivation, just trying to grapple with this and also put language to it in order to educate my son in the future. Another motivation is being a clinical social worker. I wanted resources, and I'd also speak on behalf of my team because everybody on my team, so my co-author Emily Koo and our illustrator Maggie Chen, we're all social workers, and we were sort of grappling with, hey, what resources could we share with our clients? And we weren't seeing much early on during the pandemic, so we felt like this was a real necessity. And the hope was to lift up our Asian American communities, in particular our children and parents and caregivers, and anyone, frankly, taking care of children, could be teachers, principals, social workers. So yeah, I think that was the hope and the motivation behind it.
And you, in some ways, have already answered this question, but something that we've been talking about a lot at the Human Rights Commission is these intersecting identities that we have, right? Where, like, I'm a mom, I'm also Asian American, but I'm also part of this smaller class of Hmong people. I'm also a Vermonter, a Minnesotan, a this and a that, and a lawyer, and these are all parts of our identities. How do you connect all of those identities and those roles that you have as a parent, as a social worker, in terms of the purpose of this book?
Yeah, I think that came in actually pretty like naturally, like my role and identity as a mother and a clinical social worker and a student and a wife. It's just difficult to kind of tease it apart, right? So all of me has really gone into this book, I think, in a holistic way. But particularly as it relates to my role as a social worker and a mother, on a weekly basis, I'm listening to children. I work with children who are involved in the child welfare system, so they already have a lot of histories of trauma and maltreatment that they bring to the session. So I'm listening to aid in their healing process. I'm looking for resources for them. I'm supporting their developmental and educational needs. So all of that, you know, is happening professionally, but also on a personal, like the mother level, right? I'm doing that for my son too. I'm trying to create a safe, a secure space. I'm trying to meet his everyday needs. I'm teaching actively. We're reading books together every day, you know? So I just felt like the two were sort of inextricable almost. It's hard to separate those two. And all of me, especially those two roles, really kind of infused into the book. I think it just was a natural sort of organic process of like, I want every part of me to speak into this book. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Anna, can you tell us a little bit about your book, Step from Heaven, and what sort of motivated you to write that, the meaning of the book to you and your family, and your hopes for it too?
So Step from Heaven came directly from wanting and really needing to be able to have a story out there for the little kid in me and the little kid that really hungered for stories about Asian American and immigrant, particularly immigrant lives. So I began with kind of memories of what I remembered as a little girl immigrating to the United States. And from there, the story kind of built and grew and became kind of a coming of age story that then became my first novel as a young adult writer. So it really, you know, when growing up, I didn't have books that spoke to my experience as an immigrant and kind of feeling isolated and alienated and ashamed of myself and my parents and not wanting to be different. And so the first time I really read a book that spoke to those issues was Sandra Cisneros' House on Mango Street. And when I read that book, I was just completely blown away that this young Latina girl, Esperanza, in the story, I was like, that's me, that's me. And I could identify so wholeheartedly. So when I started my novel, I really wanted to be able to honor that book, which was just such a touchstone for me. And similarly, Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior was another phenomenal book that I found not until college. And I realized that there just weren't stories like that, especially when I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s. And so there was a real need. And there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of information out there that basically shows us that there aren't enough stories that really act as windows and mirrors, as Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop talks about, windows and mirrors that help our young folks be able to relate and have empathy for one another's experiences. So it really did come from a place of wanting to honor that little kid that was hungering for the story that said, you're not alone. And so that's what I tried to do was to offer a story of kind of partly my upbringing, but also just an immigrant story.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We know that you were an English teacher for middle schoolers.
Yes.
If you were in the classroom now, how would you incorporate current events into that classroom?
I think one of the things that's really vital, and this is something that I did as an English teacher, was just bring in diverse literature. I remember when I first started teaching, I wanted to share poetry with my 8th graders. And so I had this poem by a Native American lesbian woman. One, it was like completely, like as soon as I gave it to my students, they were really, they were taken with it. It was a really powerful piece of poetry, but I immediately got yanked into the principal's office because parents had all these problems with the fact that this was, you know, representing sexuality that they didn't agree with, that this was, you know, who was this poet? You know, they didn't know this poet. This wasn't a famous poet. Why was this poetry being shared? And so they had all these questions about it. Luckily, my principal was able to talk to the parents who had all these issues, and she backed me up and said, you know, this is important. This is poetry. This is something that gets the kids talking. And so for me, it's just being able to offer stories and being able to share with students and have that conversation and dialogue that can happen in the classroom that might not be able to happen at home, right? Oftentimes there aren't safe spaces for children to explore and question in their home life, but they can possibly have that space in the classroom. And so I felt like as a teacher, that was my role, was to offer kind of a sanctuary for the students to question and to be able to ask really difficult, talk about difficult issues and things like that. So that was, I just felt like that was so important as my job as a teacher.
Wonderful. Sometimes when we think of the word empowerment, there are people who tend to think of that term as like being strong and having an opinion and being able to stand up or stand up against racism or xenophobia. But I think that one of the things that I've learned from both of you and your books is sort of that empowerment also starts up with identity and validating one's identity and one's place in the world and in America. And so the question I have for both of you is, probably now more than ever, we really need to empower our families. What does empowerment look like? And how do you define that? And yeah, how do we help families empower themselves and their children?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thanks so much for, I think, given my social work training, I'm always thinking about resources and tools. And I think that's, you know, one way to empower our families. And this is exactly what I was looking for as I was grappling with, you know, do I write this book? Where are the resources? Where could I go? What's free? You know, do I have to pay for these resources, right? Is it accessible? So I'm thinking about these things. And for our team, it really meant making sure that this book, as one resource, it's not going to address all the issues that our communities are facing, but as one resource to be out there and reach the widest, you know, audience as possible. So that meant for us being proactive about, you know, doing outreach. So we've connected with multiple professional organizations serving Asian American communities right now. We're translating it into multiple languages, the book. So we've just finished the Chinese translation. So that should be coming out pretty soon. We're finishing up a Japanese translation, a Korean one, a Thai, and of all the languages, Italian. We had a partner who had reached out from actually UK, saying that she wanted to translate the book in Italian. So, and most recently, the American Sign Language. Right, so we're trying to make this book free and accessible for folks, so we could try to get it out there to hard to reach sort of communities and populations. So I think that's one way to do it. Yeah.
So in terms of, I think, empowerment in my family, you know, my family is kind of large, and we have really strong activists in our family, which I just love. And it can be from, I mean, as simple as saying, let's go and show up and march. You know, when the Black Lives Matters movement was happening, and at the very beginning, saying educate ourselves and to support that movement. Just recently, with right after COVID hit, of course, the whole the protests that were happening, we showed up. you know, we had our masks on and we showed up. We went to the state house, and we just to like go and to say this matters, I feel like is empowering for my girls. To talk about it at home, I had an incident where I had gone to the drugstore to buy, of all things, mouse traps, because we were all potted with my sisters, and so there were mice, and we had to go and deal with the mice. But I was there, and I had these two guys come behind me, and they started coughing on my back, and then left. And I came home, and I was like, I don't know, do you think they were coughing? Because, you know, just to have that conversation. And so already there had been so many incidents in the news with racism against Asian people and of Asian descent. And so it was one of those things that was in the back of my mind. And from that point on, my sister Jacqueline Woodson was like, you are not going out to go shopping or doing anything again, because she was just so appalled that this had happened, and she wanted to make sure to keep me safe. But I think the conversations that we're having at home about what's happening currently, also the conversations, we have a lot of conversations about the history of Asian Americans in this country, and the racism and all the different tropes, like the model minority trope, the yellow peril, like just tracking the history of how we have faced systemic racism. And a lot of times we're seen as white adjacent, but you know, in fact, Asian Americans have probably, I mean, culturally, they have so much that they deal with in terms of not speaking up, right? But at the same time, in order to have that conversation, we do need to speak up. And so that's something that we talk a lot about, especially being here in Vermont and not having a lot of faces that look like our own. We definitely have to do that kind of support within the family and within the broader kind of within my family. And then outside of that, my community, I really try and offer a lot of different influences and role models for my kids so that they can continue to feel empowered and see that they're not different, but that in fact, they are part of, you know, the greater global community, which is so diverse, right?
Thank you. So here's why I identified you as a Vermonter, Anna. I'm changing my language around who is a Vermonter and who gets to identify as a Vermonter. And so I've decided that if you live in Vermont currently, that you get to identify as a Vermonter, and then, or say otherwise. And one of the stereotypes about Asian Americans is that we're not from here, whatever that means. Either not from Vermont or not from this country, born elsewhere, or somehow like it takes being born in a physical location to be from there. And I don't know why that is, other than xenophobia and racism, or ways to sort of classify different groups of people. But I am trying to shift the way that we look at who belongs and who doesn't by really calling myself a Vermonter, because I've lived here 5 years, and that I really do share a lot of commonalities with other Vermonters, whether they're born or raised here, or whether they're like the 10th generation here. And some of those commonalities are, I love it here. I enjoy the foliage just like everybody else. I probably really dislike the tourists just like everybody else. And especially during fall season and ski season. And so I go, you know, I think those are the factors that make me a Vermonter. So I'm okay with that. And so I think there's power in language too, and identity. And so thank you both for that. The next question I have for you is, how do you empower children? And how do you know when children are empowered? What does that look like?
Yeah, I could maybe give it a go here. I think so many things come to my mind, but if I could maybe start with, you know, knowing that it's never too early to have a conversation with your child, you know, I think maybe I'll start with that. Yeah, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, you know, by the age of 6 months, a baby can recognize race-based differences, right? And that's phenomenal to think about, that such a young child, a baby, an infant, could already recognize those differences. And by, you know, 2 to 4, racial biases are, you know, internalized, is what the research community says. And by 12, you know, by the age of 12, certain beliefs about culture and race are pretty much set, right? So we have this window, about a decade, to work, you know, with our children very proactively, to have these critical conversations about race and racism, and to empower them, to give them language, again, resources and tools, to be able to say, hey, you know, that didn't feel good. That's not right. You know, hey, what you're saying is racist. I'm going to call it out. I'm going to put language to it. So I think starting early is critically important, as early as you can. It's never too late. And I love that, Anna, you talked about, you know, these conversations maybe weren't happening with our own parents, or, you know, it's difficult in Asian American families to have these conversations. And I think that's something that I wanted to highlight too. And I also grew up from a family where it was like, hush, hush, don't talk about it. You know, we're not gonna, you know, entertain that. And I didn't know where to go with this feelings of isolation and marginalization, and feeling confused and kind of paralyzed, you know, like, I don't like myself and I don't know where it's coming from and I can't articulate it. And I feel like I'm the only person who goes through this, right? And come to find out that's not the case. My team and I were talking about how we all felt marginalized and discriminated against. We all had incidents of bullying in school, you know, even into adulthood. I was just talking to a colleague of mine who said, so when are you going to go back to your country? You know, and yes. And it was in the context of like looking for jobs. I'm on the job market, academic job market. And she was like, well, would you go back to Korea? And I was like, you know, I'm not actually from there. I'm from California. You know, I'm American just as much as you are. So yeah, so I think it's important to maybe start these conversations early on and equip our children to have the language. One thing that I thought was really helpful, I wanted to introduce to our audience here. So the American Psychological Association, Division 45, which is the Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, has a task force, COVID-19 task force, to fight against anti-Asian discrimination. And recently they came out with a really awesome and simple strategies for parents to kind of consider as they think about what they should do to help our children, you know, should they face an incident of racism and discrimination during this time. So the strategy is called acknowledge, validate, and reframe. So you start by acknowledging what had happened, right? So if a kid comes back, you know, from the park, I don't know, outdoors, and says like, this is what happened, you know, acknowledging, recognizing that, you know, that happened. And you can say something like, COVID-19 is making a lot of people angry and mad right now, you know, and they could say really horrible things. So, you know, putting language to that incident. And then the next is validate your child's feelings, right? So putting, again, language into not just what they've experienced, but their feelings themselves, right? So saying something like, these words or that action by that person was really hurtful. That's really, really sad and painful, right? And then the next is reframing the event to prevent the child from internalizing some of those negative messages. So saying something like, it's not your fault, right? What they say doesn't define you. You know, that's not who you are. And I would even add to that language of pride, right? You can be proud of being Korean American. You can be proud of being Chinese American. You know, you have a rich history, culture, and background. And I love that we talked about history a little bit too. Just helping our children remember, like, there's a beautiful lineage, there's a beautiful history and a background that they could really embrace into their identity, I think is going to be critical. Yeah.
That was amazing, Joyce. Thank you so much for that. That is so helpful. I think that's, I'm like, thank you. Acknowledge, validate, reframe. Okay.
I was reminded, Joyce, while you were talking about talking to kids and empowering kids, about how maybe as adults we really don't give kids enough credit for what they see in the world and their roles in the world and their roles in creating an equitable and just world for themselves as well. And so we tend to maybe shy away from having those conversations, maybe because it's more difficult for us than it is for our children to engage in those conversations. And I was reminded of this. It was a presentation that I was putting on called What Are Human Rights for 10-Year-Olds? And we were talking about discrimination, and I said to them, do you know that there are some landlords in Vermont that don't want to rent to kids? And the kids were like, oh, what? They were outraged. And I said, why do you think that would be the case? And then there was a kid that said, is it because kids are naughty and they break things and they draw on walls? And I said, yeah, that could be. And then another kid said, well, that's not fair. That's not all of us. Not all kids are naughty and like that. And I said, yes, that's also true. And then we had a conversation about, well, what if that people just thought generally that that was true about kids? Let's pretend for a second that maybe some of that is true. Is that still okay? And what would happen if we allowed landlords not to rent to kids in Vermont when it's cold 9 months out of the year? And they were like, whoa, yeah, we would have a lot of kids who are homeless, and how unfair that is, and how important it is to have a law to say that's not okay. And I thought that was just really beautiful, because they already knew all the answers to what equity ought to be and what equity ought to look like. And so I think we don't give enough credit to our kids to engage in these really difficult conversations. And I also think that, and I just want to name it, that it's also privilege to not have these conversations, right? Like if a child has a disability in school and they're having a difficult time because of their disability, I am sure that they're bringing that home, and some of those conversations are probably happening around that child's disability, whether they call it that or not. But for other children who might not have disabilities, that their families are not necessarily engaging those conversations regularly because they are privileged not to have to do that. And the importance of recognizing that, if like partly we're exercising privilege when we don't have these conversations, because these conversations are happening in a lot of BIPOC homes on a regular basis, whether we call it that or not. And so I think that's also really important too.
I think that's such a great point, Board, that yes, we do have the privilege in some ways of not having those conversations, and that absolutely is. And that's why I think part of what I feel so strongly about in terms of being able to expose my kids to a diverse group of folks is that then they can have those conversations, right? Sometimes. So part of, Joyce, when you were talking about the way to respond, to acknowledge and to validate and to reframe, I was thinking also one of the things that I do know has been so helpful for my girls has been to have other kids who share similar experiences or say, oh yeah, that's racist, or to talk about it. So my younger one has a cousin that she can call anytime she needs help. She will call Jackson, and Jackson will be like, oh my gosh, Ronnie, that was so racist. And just for her to like have some other kid her age be able to validate her experience and to call it out is so incredibly helpful to her, versus, sometimes a parent can do that, but they don't really quite give us the same power as they do to, a cousin or a friend, just a peer who says, I get it, or, I I understand, or that's terrible. And so I really find that it's important to surround my kids with other kids who can also be kind and thoughtful and can be a support network for them. So I see that with Ondina, my little one, all the time, that she needs her Jackson, she needs her Toshi, she needs all these other kids that she looks up to and respects as well.
We have a lot of teachers who are really interested in doing work around social justice and who are really committed to making the classroom more equitable. What are your thoughts about, and what are your thoughts about that, and what are some tools that we can give teachers on how to incorporate social justice issues in the classroom? I don't know what it was like for you growing up, but growing up for me, social justice issues maybe showed up in like a civics course, but not usually in English or art or music or in all of these, or in even physical education, really, in any of the other classes that we typically take. How do we help our teachers do that and think about that more effectively?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And maybe I'll just share an anecdote. So last Friday, I think it was last Friday, I was invited as a guest speaker to a morning rally at one of the elementary schools in the San Francisco Unified School District. And it was a Zoom rally. So I'm going in with 200 kids, doing their morning stretches led by the principal. It was beautiful. I got teary a little bit to see like such beautiful children over Zoom, and what a privilege to be in that space together. But really, the goal was to introduce the book, do a read aloud, and to talk about these issues, right? Before going into the Zoom session, the para teacher and the social worker there had informed me that our communities, primarily and predominantly API, Asian American, excuse me. So this is pertinent, this is an important book for us, and we want you to speak to that a little bit, the motivation for the book, the summary of the book, and how to combat bullying in school. So I shared some tips and strategies, but I thought that was a wonderful way to, engage children, do a read aloud, invite Anna, right? Who's a real author. I'm a researcher primarily, so this was really awkward. I didn't mention that in the beginning, but I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not qualified to write this book. But really, but yeah, doing something like that was, to me, it was such a beautiful thing. And I wish I had that when I was going to elementary school or even high school. I didn't have any of that. But I thought that was brilliant. So using books and storytelling and bringing in guest speakers who are authors who could speak to the children's experiences of, grappling with social justice issues, I think would be wonderful.
So I do this quote by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop all the time with teachers, and I'm going to read this because I just admire her so much. Books are sometimes windows offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. These windows are also sliding glass doors, and readers have only to walk through in imagination to become part of whatever world has been created or recreated by the author. When lighting conditions are just right, however, a window can also be a mirror. Literature transforms human experience and reflects it back to us. And in that reflection, we can see our own lives and experiences as part of the larger human experience. Reading then becomes a means of self-affirmation, and readers often seek their mirrors in books. So one of the things that I talk about with educators all the time and with librarians is the fact that, just by offering stories and letting the kids be able to look at all these different kinds of stories, that in and of itself is such a powerful, powerful act. And I think about Amanda, who has been so tireless in her work to try to get ethnic studies funded and to be able to offer funding for our teachers so that they can educate themselves, because so much of what isn't happening is that teachers aren't being given the resources, the time, and the support that they need to really understand for themselves how to begin to help their students. And so it really begins with the teachers, right? It begins with the parents, it begins with all of us. And then that kind of effect will then obviously resonate and radiate out to our children. And so I just so appreciate that Amanda has been doing this work, that there's so many different legislators out there doing the work to try to support our educators, because they need that support, and nothing can get done unless they have that ability to really understand, so that they can go on to pass that to the students.
Thank you. Thank you both. I was, as you both were talking, I was thinking about, well, Joyce, I almost appreciated what you said, American Asian, and then corrected yourself and it said Asian American. And it reminded me, I love it actually, because it reminded me of a training that we did where one of the individuals was Asian, and she said that I'm really tired of identifying as Asian American, as if being American is the default and that means white, but I have to be Asian American, meaning I'm not just American. And I'm also learning that, and I've known this, but I'm also learning that it is okay for each of us to also identify as we see fit. And that not all Asians identify as Asian or Asian American or whatever. And so I really appreciated that. I think that when our teachers are not thinking about equity, the reality is that the default is white, right? That is the default. So it isn't that you are incorporating equity and social justice issues because you have to, or because it's because if you don't do it, actually the default is white. And so like, if you're not, like, let's say you're a music teacher and you're not thinking about equity, most of the songs that you're picking are probably white. And if you're an English teacher and you're not thinking about equity, the default is that you're actually picking white authors and white stories. And those is because that's what's available and that's what you're lifting up regularly. So you're perpetuating white supremacy unless you're actually actively thinking about equity and how to like incorporate equity into your work and your curriculum.
Even just like math. I mean, think about math problems. You know, when you read the kinds of math problems, there's so many different ways that you could completely change that story around in terms of a math problem. But it is the default. Bohr, I think you're absolutely right. The default is to fall back on certain ideas of what is considered normal and traditional, right?
Yeah.
And that is white. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so commonplace that I think we don't even think that that's what we're doing, but it is in fact true. I was, we were lucky that we had a program one year at our kids' school where they decided that year that they were going to elevate like female musicians and artists, and they were going to sing all these songs that were written by female artists. And then they decided that they would focus on jazz and blues, which actually elevated like a lot of Black Americans. And had they not done that, and in previous years, really it all had been white artists and white songs. And so I just thought that was really interesting, how important it is to sort of always be thinking about it. Both of you have kind of answered this question already, but I wanted to see if you wanted to have any follow-up to it. It's important to have conversations with our kids about xenophobia and racism even before an incident has occurred. How do you do that at home and in your communities? Rather than reacting to something, is being proactive. And I know you both mentioned books and using stories, and I love that. Any other thoughts about that?
I might just say, in addition to what we already talked about, right, we talked about using stories and books, which is what I was going to mention. Another thing that I wanted to maybe introduce was this is again from Division 45 of APA, and it's really borrowed from like anti-bullying movement strategies, but it's called the use your wits strategy. So this is something that could be introduced, I think, even before an event happens to a child, but preparing our children, giving them the option to think about what can I do, should an incident happen, right? So WITS stands for walking away, ignoring the perpetrator, talking it out with the perpetrator if it's safe to do so, and then seeking help or support, right? So introducing these tips like, hey, these are your options. You could, walk away, you can ignore, or if you feel like it's safe of an environment and space to do so, you could talk with that person. You could share how you're feeling or your thoughts, or correct the message that's coming through, and make sure you ask for support, seek help. So I thought that was another pithy sort of, brief, easy to kind of digest tip for parents and caregivers that could potentially be introduced to children. So I wanted to put that out there. But yeah, going back to stories, sharing our stories as children, sharing our stories as adults. I wish my parents did that more. And I'm taking away the message that I should do more for my children, more my child and my children going forward. So yeah, I think those are some of the things that I wanted to share. But
I think for me, just, living in Vermont and not being from here and having kids of Asian descent, we have had lots of conversations just by the fact that we don't see others who look like us. And so there's a lot of conversation about what it's like to live here, whether, I think because I moved here from California, my biggest concern was, did I do the right thing by having my kids be in such an isolated environment? Because I remember growing up, and this is something that my kids all knew, that when I was growing up, I faced a lot of racism. I grew up in San Diego, in a very more remote area. You think California, San Diego, oh yeah, that's so diverse. And it's like, no, I grew up in a completely homogenous, lower middle class, in the outskirts neighborhood. And I was teased relentlessly to the point that I just stopped talking. I thought if I stopped talking, people wouldn't notice me. And so it began with kind of personal stories and really talking to my girls. And I think I was hyper vigilant about, did anybody say anything to you that could be remotely, hurtful? And so when I first moved here, it was a lot of conversations from my end anyway, just checking in, making sure, how do you feel? Do you feel comfortable? Making sure that the girls had good role models, that, that the teachers knew that I was present. I remember going in and sharing a Korean, Lunar New Year, and going in. So I did this for both girls, but going in really early to get to know her cohorts and to say, I'm her mother, and these are some celebrations that we have from our history and our family. And so just being kind of proactive that way and being around for my girls, and especially when they were younger. And so it was always, I think, a conversation more than they actually wanted, probably. This is my experience. How are you feeling? What are you thinking about? How should we celebrate Asian American culture? So it definitely came in early for them, because I was very aware of not wanting them to feel ashamed or different, and knowing that I was making a choice to raise them here in Vermont. So it's still one of those struggles. I still wonder, should we be here? Should we be with other Asians in California? Because it'd be, that is a choice. But Vermont is so lovely, and there are so many wonderful people here that I think they also understand why it's, you can't have it all, right? You can't be in California and have the beauty of Vermont. So it's definitely some things to think about.
I share the same, or shared the same concerns too when I moved here from Minneapolis. Sort of this, because I grew up in a huge family and a huge Hmong community. And when we were moving here, I was like, oh my gosh, we're moving to a very white state. It's very rural. There's not a lot of diversity. Are my kids going to lose that part of their identity and themselves? And being really nervous about that and having to really kind of grieve that for a little bit. And then also recognizing that I'm their mom. Like I just because I moved to Vermont doesn't mean I've stopped being Asian. And I carry all of those identities within myself and in everything that I do. And that our kids learn so much from watching us and seeing us, more so than even what we say, and us taking value in who we are. And I just think that some of those concerns has in some ways gone away. One of the things that I've learned from a few Asian American friends in Vermont is that here in and I'm sorry to be talking about Vermont so much, Joyce, but like
okay.
Vermont,
It's so relatable because like Michigan's like 70% white too.
okay,
So,
okay,
yeah,
great,
yeah. So this is completely we're on the same page.
Okay. So one of the things that a couple of friends have told me about growing up in Vermont is that they experienced discrimination, but they were all alone. And I experienced discrimination too, but I was not isolated. I had a ton of Asian Americans, Black American friends. It was very diverse. And so I just felt empowered because of that diversity. And the importance of, and I say this over and over again, I'll probably in every single webinar, is the importance of allies and other people standing up for each other. And how it's just as important for us to stand up for Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ and plus and people with disabilities, because we can be so isolated, and it is important to sort of share in those struggles. And that kind of leads us to our next stories. Our next question, which you both kind of have answered a little bit too, which is how do you utilize your own stories, and your own stories and your own traumas to work for liberation of us, yourself, of others, our family members, but also generally? That's hard.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Reflecting on some of, what I've gone through growing up in this country and what my family went through. I think it's, painful to reflect on it and try to use it for good. I think that we talked about like going against the grain, like trying to not default back on like white supremacy, but actively, it's almost like a treadmill, like you're like running, counter to that belt that's wanting to go the other direction. So I think it's difficult to be intentional, but it's so necessary. And it's so critical to do that right now during these times. For me, I think I reflect on how oppression for one group is oppression for all, so like you said, for like what's happening in the Black community should be really important. Like it's an imperative for the Asian American community. We have to lean in, we have to. And I love the fact that, Anna, you're going out there with your family for the Black Lives Matter protests. I've done the same, just put, my son on, a backpack carrier, and I'm protesting too in the front lines with my Black colleagues and my BIPOC colleagues for justice here. At the same time, I think it's so important for our BIPOC colleagues to also lean into what we're going through, right? The Asian American community, with all the misnomers of coronavirus, just coming from top down, right? Calling it Chinese virus, Kung flu, just awful things, and the consequences of that, right? Manifested in racist behavior, hate crime, xenophobia, all the things that we talked about. I think it's important for our Black communities, our brown communities to lean into what we're experiencing too. And I think when we do that, there's this energy, there's this synergy that we could, maybe start to move the needle to co-liberation, right? Where my freedom is completely tied to your freedom and your freedom is tied to mine. Like we do this together. I can't save you. You're not going to save me. We're in this together to help each other out, to support each other, to move towards liberation and freedom together. So I think that's what I've been reflecting on. I feel like trying to grapple with this is like a journey. Like I'm not going to figure it out today because I'm in a webinar. I'm not going to figure it out tomorrow. It's like you said, just kind of inching towards it every day, making that choice every day. So yeah, I think that's what I'm grappling with at the moment.
Well, I've definitely used my stories to kind of, put it down on page in order to come to terms with a lot of the experiences that I had. And so for me, my personal stories are important just in terms of the writing that I do, but I think in terms of sharing experiences with my family and with my children, that's been really vital in order to share with them, because the only ways to really make differences is if we can connect to each other on that personal level. And sharing stories is one of the most intimate ways to say, look, if you've experienced discrimination, bullying, any kid, a white boy in Vermont who feels isolated because maybe they're from a poor background, that feeling of isolation and shame, they can then understand how a poor Black person in Brooklyn might feel those same kinds of feelings. And I think that's where the moments of connection really come in. And when we begin to connect with each other on that kind of personal level, that is then becomes the road to change, right? Because we don't want other people to feel that way. And I love what you said, Joyce, about the fact that your liberation is tied to my liberation. And I think for so long, the whole trope of the model minority that came about in I think it was in the 80s. In the 60s, that whole trope came into existence in order to divide and conquer, because that was during the height of the civil rights movement, right? So if they could hold up one minority and be like, look at how they're doing so well, why can't you all just be quiet and do what they're doing? That whole thing, the divide and conquer mentality, is ridiculous. And so I think more than ever, we're really starting to see how everybody is mobilizing and really trying to stand up for each other. And I think that's one of the things that right now, so currently with the Black Lives Matters movement, I think, and all the xenophobia and what's happening with the pandemic, I think it's vital that our children be able to understand what it is to mobilize, right, for each other, because it is so tied together that we need to do this together in order to make everyone's lives better, not just, the marginalized communities, but in fact, you know what, white people, you have a lot to learn. And by mobilizing and being able to share ethnic studies, they are getting richer for it. And I think that's where they need to be kind of, the reframe, like, you are only going to get richer from knowing that there are so many other experiences, and they will become windows for you to understand, and also mirrors that can help you understand yourself even better. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, just so important, Joyce, what you were saying.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And that was such a hard question. You both answered it so eloquently and beautifully. Thank you so much for that. We'd like to invite anybody to ask any questions that they'd like. We're at the hour. I see a comment here. Something I find with my sons is using times of transition to talk about things on a walk, in the car. Preparing dinner can be a great time to have a conversation. My husband and I also have the perspective that learning is constant. And so we talk about race, equity, religion, and gender when at the grocery store, reading a book, and at a festival. And I think that's beautiful. It's sort of just really all the time, in every class, in every classroom, in every curriculum, and every space is to be thinking about this and incorporating this. And I think that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. Any other thoughts, Anna and Joyce? Anything that came up that made you want to add to, or
I don't know if I shared this, I had a chance to share this, but wanted to just, make sure I can point to maybe where the free version of the book and also the translations will live for anyone who would like to take a look at Young, Proud, and Seongji. So right now it's living on my personal website, joyceYlee.com, and it's freely downloadable there. But we're in the process of there's been such a demand for translations and also for hard copies. So we've decided as a team to build a website for the book itself. So that should be launching soon, and I'll have that information on my website. But we're trying to, make sure all the translations are, freely downloadable too. So just wanted to, I don't know if I shared that before, but just wanted to put that out there in case folks are wondering where to get the book and the translations and whatnot.
And I think Amanda had said that she would have some resources, like a whole list of resources or something available. And so I would love to have that. I don't know if there's an email or somewhere where we could find those, but I was going to offer, I'm happy to, for that resource page, share the article by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop about the Windows mirrors. There's also a list, I have a list of American Library Awards that honor diversity from, American Indian Youth Literature Award, Asian American Literature Award. There's the Coretta Scott King Awards, the Pura Belpre Award. So a lot of different kinds, the Snyder Family Association, the Stonewall Book Award. So there's lots and lots of ways. There's different organizations like We Need Diverse Books. And so if we can put all that together on some kind of handout or whatever people can use as a.
Yeah, we'll be working on that, and then we can, so I will contact you and we can put it on a page, and then I'll send it to the attendees. Also, the 15th of this month, we're going to have a webinar training on bystander intervention. So it's, how to deal with xenophobia and racism, whether you're in the classroom, how do you talk to your kids, and more like training and conversation with two other organizations, the Peace and Justice Center and Central Vermont Showing Up for Racial Justice, where we're going to be talking about the best tactics to deal with. So I really appreciate Joyce. Little training that we got, that was pretty amazing, and so we'll send out the list with the book, with Joyce's book, and please read Anna's book. They're really good, and check her out, and yeah.
So I just want to end by thanking both of our wonderful panelists today, Anna and Joyce Lee, for really giving us your time and your wisdom. And I want to thank our participants today for giving us the last hour and 10 minutes of your time as well to be part of this conversation. We really appreciate it. And as I said at the beginning of the hour, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Human Rights Commission if you've experienced discrimination or know someone who has. And if you live or work in a place where you think they are in need of resources and training, just don't hesitate to reach out to us and Amanda or myself personally. So thank you, and we hope you have a wonderful evening and weekend.